The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Independence, Missouri, as Martha Henderson loaded the last of her belongings into the weathered wagon. Her hands trembled slightly as she tied down the canvas cover, not from the cool spring air, but from the weight of what she was about to do. Behind her, two small faces peered out from the wagon bed, their eyes wide with uncertainty. "Mama, are we really leaving forever?" asked 8-year-old Tommy, his voice barely above a whisper. His sister Lucy, just 5 years old, clutched her worn ragdoll tighter as she waited for an answer. Martha took a deep breath and turned to face her children. "We're going to find a new home, sweetheart. A place where we can start over." She tried to keep her voice steady, but inside her heart was pounding. The small farm that had been her husband's dream had become her nightmare after his death from pneumonia 6 months ago. The bank wanted their money, the neighbors whispered behind her back, and the crops had failed 2 years running. The wagon train stretched out before them like a long, dusty snake. 43 wagons filled with families, dreamers, and fortune seekers, all heading west toward California. Martha had spent her last $20 to join this group, hoping that somewhere out there, beyond the endless plains, she could build a life for her children. "Welcome to the Henderson family," called out a cheerful voice. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands approached their wagon. "I'm Mrs. Patterson, and this here's my husband, Frank." She gestured to a bearded man who tipped his hat politely. "We're right behind you in the line. Got 3 young ones of our own." Martha felt a flutter of hope. "It's wonderful to meet you. I'm Martha, and these are my children, Tommy and Lucy." Mrs. Patterson's smile faltered slightly when she noticed there was no man with them. "Just the 3 of you, then?" "Yes, ma'am. My husband passed last winter." Martha's voice caught slightly. "Oh, you poor dear." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "Well, don't you worry. We'll all look out for each other on this journey. That's what folks do out here." As the wagon train began to move, Martha felt a mixture of terror and excitement. The oxen pulling her wagon were borrowed from a neighbor who'd taken pity on her situation. She'd learned to handle them in the past few weeks, but the reins still felt foreign in her hands. Every step forward took them further from everything familiar and deeper into the unknown. The first few days passed peacefully enough. The weather was pleasant, and the children seemed to enjoy the adventure. Tommy walked alongside the wagon sometimes, collecting interesting rocks and chasing butterflies. Lucy sang little songs from the wagon bed, her voice carrying on the wind. Martha began to think maybe, just maybe, they might actually make it to California, but by the 4th day things started to change. Tommy complained of feeling tired and didn't want to walk anymore. Martha assumed it was just the strain of the journey, but when she felt his forehead that evening, it was burning hot with fever. "Mrs. Patterson," Martha called softly across the camp that night, "could you take a look at Tommy? He's feeling poorly." The older woman hurried over, her face creased with concern. She placed her hand on Tommy's forehead and frowned. "He's got quite a fever, dear. Let me get some willow bark tea brewing. That should help bring it down." Word spread quickly through the camp. By morning, several families had heard about the sick boy in the Henderson wagon. Martha noticed people glancing their way, their conversations stopping when she passed. She tried to ignore it, focusing on caring for Tommy, who was now shivering despite the warm spring air. "Maybe it's just a cold," she told herself, but deep down, she knew it was more serious than that. Dr. Williams, a physician traveling with his family to set up practice in California, examined Tommy on the 2nd day of his illness. He was a thin, serious man with gentle hands and worried eyes. "It's a fever, certainly," he told Martha quietly, away from the other families. "Could be any number of things. We'll need to watch him carefully and keep him comfortable." But comfort was hard to find on the trail. The wagon bounced and jolted over ruts and rocks, making Tommy cry out in pain. Martha did her best to cushion him with quilts and blankets, but she could see her son was suffering. By the 3rd day, whispers had turned to open concern. Martha overheard conversations around the evening fires. "That boy's been sick for days now," said one man, his voice carrying across the camp. "What if it's something catching?" I got children to think about, added another. Can't have them exposed to whatever that is. Martha felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. These people had seemed so friendly just days ago. Now they looked at her family like they carried some terrible curse. The wagon master, a gruff man named Captain Morrison, approached her wagon on the fourth morning. He was tall and weathered, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much of the world's hardships. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice formal and cold, "we need to talk." Martha's heart sank. She'd been expecting this conversation, dreading it, but knowing it would come. "How's the boy this morning?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Better, I think," Martha lied, glancing back at Tommy, who was pale and listless in the wagon bed. "The fever broke during the night." Captain Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Ma'am, I've been leading wagon trains for 15 years. I know what a sick child looks like." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "The other families are getting nervous. They're talking about ... concerns." "What kind of concerns?" Martha asked, though she already knew. "They're worried about contagion, about their own children catching whatever your boy has." He shifted uncomfortably. "I've got 42 other families to think about, Mrs. Henderson. 42 families who paid good money to get safely to California." Martha felt the world tilting beneath her feet. "You can't be suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything yet," Captain Morrison said. "But if that boy doesn't show real improvement soon, well, I might not have a choice." That night, Martha sat beside Tommy's makeshift bed in the wagon, holding his small hand in hers. Lucy slept curled up beside them, her doll tucked under her chin. The sounds of the camp settling down for the night drifted through the canvas walls, but Martha felt more alone than she ever had in her life. She thought about her husband, about the promises they'd made to each other, about the dreams they'd shared. He'd wanted to give their children a better life, opportunities he'd never had. Now she was trying to honor that dream, but it seemed like the world was determined to stop her. Tommy stirred in his sleep, mumbling something she couldn't understand. His fever had indeed broken, just as she'd told the captain, but he was still weak and tired. Martha smoothed his damp hair back from his forehead and whispered a prayer into the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions. But tonight she was still part of the wagon train, still moving toward their dream of a better life. She closed her eyes and tried to believe that somehow everything would work out. After all, it had to. Her children were counting on her, and she was all they had left in the world. The morning of the fifth day brought an ominous silence to the camp. Martha noticed it immediately when she stepped out of her wagon to check on the oxen. Usually the air buzzed with morning chatter, children's laughter, and the sounds of families preparing for another day on the trail. Today, conversation stopped when she appeared. Eyes turned away. Neighbors who had shared evening meals with her family now busied themselves with sudden tasks. Tommy was sitting up in the wagon, his color better than it had been in days. He'd even managed to eat some of the cornbread Mrs. Patterson had brought over the night before. Martha felt a surge of relief washing over her. Her son was getting better. Surely now the other families would see there was nothing to fear. "Mama, why is everyone acting so strange?" Lucy asked, peeking out from under the wagon cover. Her big brown eyes were filled with confusion. "They're just tired from the journey, sweetheart," Martha said, forcing a smile. "Everyone will feel better once we get moving." But as the morning wore on, Martha began to realize this wasn't about tiredness. When she approached the water barrel that the families shared, Mrs. Patterson quickly moved her own children away. When she tried to help another woman whose wagon wheel had come loose, she was politely but firmly told her assistance wasn't needed. The breaking point came at the noon rest stop. Martha was sitting beside her wagon, giving Tommy some water and checking his temperature again. His fever was completely gone, and he was asking if he could walk for a while that afternoon. It was the first time in days he'd shown interest in anything beyond sleeping. Captain Morrison approached with 3 other men Martha recognized as leaders among the families. Their faces were grave, their steps deliberate. Martha's heart began to race as she stood to meet them. "Mrs. Henderson," Captain Morrison began, his voice formal and distant. "We need to discuss the situation with your boy. Tommy's much better," Martha said quickly. "His fever broke completely. Look at him, he's sitting up, talking, wanting to walk. Whatever he had, it's passing." "That may be," said Mr. Collins, a stern man with a thick beard who led one of the larger families. "But the damage might already be done. My youngest has been coughing this morning. So has the Peterson girl." Martha felt her stomach drop. "Children cough for all sorts of reasons. The dust, the dry air." "We can't take that chance," interrupted Mr. Bradley, another family leader. "We've got women and children to protect. If this thing spreads through the whole train, what exactly are you saying?" Martha asked, though she could see the answer in their faces. Captain Morrison cleared his throat. "If the families have voted, Mrs. Henderson, we're going to have to ask you to remain here while we continue on." The words hit Martha like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her hand reaching for the wagon wheel to steady herself. "You can't be serious. You're talking about leaving us here in the middle of nowhere." "There's a settlement about 60 miles east," Mr. Collins said, avoiding her eyes. "You could go back there, wait for another wagon train." 60 miles? Martha's voice cracked. "With 2 small children, on foot?" "You have a wagon," Mr. Bradley pointed out. "The oxen belong to my neighbor back in Missouri. I have to return them when I get to California or send money for them. I can't take them backward." Martha's mind was racing, trying to find some argument that would change their minds. "Please, you have to understand. My son is better. Whatever he had, it's over." "We can't take that risk," Captain Morrison said firmly. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Henderson, I truly am. But I've got 42 other families counting on me to get them safely to California." Martha looked around at the faces of people who had been her friends, her companions, her support system for the past week. Mrs. Patterson stood in the distance, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't step forward to defend Martha. Dr. Williams was examining his own medical bag, unable to meet her eyes. Even the children who had played with Tommy and Lucy were being held back by their parents. "This is wrong," Martha whispered. "This is so wrong." "Life's not always fair, ma'am," Captain Morrison said, "but it's the way it has to be." That afternoon, Martha watched in numb disbelief as the wagon train prepared to move on without them. Families packed up their belongings, hitched their oxen, and formed their familiar line. Mrs. Patterson approached Martha's wagon one last time, her face red with crying. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, pressing a small cloth bag into Martha's hands. "It's not much, but it's some dried meat and hardtack. I wish ... wish things were different." Martha wanted to be angry, wanted to scream at this woman who had seemed so kind but was now abandoning them. Instead, she just nodded. "Thank you for the food." "I'll pray for you," Mrs. Patterson said. "I'll pray every day that you make it safely." Somewhere, as the wagon train rolled away, Martha stood beside her own wagon with Tommy and Lucy clinging to her skirts. The sound of creaking wheels and lowing oxen grew fainter and fainter until finally there was nothing but the endless whisper of wind across the prairie grass. "Mama," Tommy said in a small voice, "why didn't they wait for us?" Martha knelt down and pulled both children close. "Sometimes people get scared, honey. They make decisions that aren't very kind when they're scared. Are we going to be okay?" Lucy asked, her voice muffled against Martha's shoulder. Martha looked around at the vast emptiness surrounding them. Miles and miles of grassland stretched in every direction, broken only by the occasional stream or stand of trees. The wagon tracks left by the train were already beginning to blur in the afternoon wind. She had no idea which direction led to the settlement Captain Morrison had mentioned. She had no idea how to survive out here alone with 2 small children, but looking down at their trusting faces, Martha found strength she didn't know she possessed. "Yes," she said firmly. "We're going to be okay. We're going to follow those wagon tracks and catch up with another train, or we're going to find our way to a town, but we're going to be okay." That night, camped alone under the vast star-filled sky, Martha made plans. She had the canvas from her wagon, some cooking supplies, The food Mrs. Patterson had given her, and a small amount of water. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. The children slept fitfully beside her, pressed close for warmth and comfort. Martha lay awake, staring up at the stars and listening to the sounds of the night. Somewhere out there, coyotes were calling to each other. The wind rustled through the grass like whispered secrets. And far in the distance, she could hear the lonely call of a night bird. Tomorrow, she would have to make the hardest decision of her life. Should she try to follow the wagon train, hoping to catch up before her supplies ran out? Should she head back east toward the settlement, even though she wasn't sure of the direction? Or should she stay put and hope another wagon train would come along? As dawn approached, Martha made her choice. She would follow the tracks. Even if the people had rejected her, the path they'd taken was still heading west, toward California, toward the new life she'd promised her children. She might not be traveling with them anymore, but she could still follow their trail. She had no way of knowing that this decision would nearly cost them everything. The first day of walking was the hardest thing Martha had ever done. She'd made the painful decision to leave most of their belongings behind with the wagon, taking only what they could carry. The canvas wagon cover became a makeshift pack filled with the little food they had, one cooking pot, and a precious water container that was already half empty. Tommy tried to be brave, but Martha could see the confusion in his eyes. Just a week ago, he'd been riding safely in a wagon surrounded by other families. Now he walked beside his mother across endless grassland, his small hand gripping hers tightly. Lucy rode on Martha's back when she got tired, her thin arms wrapped around her mother's neck. "Mama, my feet hurt," Lucy whispered after they'd been walking for hours. The sun was directly overhead now, beating down on them without mercy. "I know, sweetheart," Martha panted, adjusting the makeshift pack on her shoulders. "Let's rest by that tree over there." She pointed to a lone cottonwood in the distance, the only shade visible for miles under the tree's thin shadow. Martha gave each child a small sip of water and a piece of the dried meat Mrs. Patterson had given them. She forced herself to eat too, though her stomach was twisted with worry. At this rate, their food would last maybe 3 days. Their water, if they were careful, might stretch to 2. "Are we lost, Mama?" Tommy asked quietly, looking around at the endless sea of grass. Martha followed his gaze. The wagon tracks they'd been following were getting harder to see. Wind and weather had already begun to erase them. "No, honey. We're just taking a different path than we planned." That afternoon, they walked through a valley where the grass grew tall enough to brush against Martha's waist. It was beautiful in a way, like walking through a green ocean, but it was also terrifying. She couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. What if they were walking in circles? What if they'd already lost the trail completely? By evening, they'd found a small stream. Martha wanted to cry with relief when she heard the sound of running water. The children drank deeply while Martha refilled their container and washed their faces. For the first time all day, she allowed herself to feel a moment of hope. "We'll camp here tonight," she told them, spreading out the canvas under a cluster of bushes. "Tomorrow we'll follow the stream. Streams always lead somewhere." The second day was worse. The stream led them away from the wagon tracks, but Martha didn't realize it until it was too late to turn back. The children were weaker now, walking more slowly, complaining more often. Martha's own strength was fading. The pack seemed to grow heavier with each step, and her water container felt lighter. "I can't walk anymore," Lucy sobbed, sitting down hard in the grass. "My legs hurt too much." Martha looked at her daughter's small face, streaked with tears and dirt, and felt something break inside her chest. She knelt down and pulled both children close. "It's okay, baby. We'll rest here for a while." But even as she said it, Martha knew they couldn't afford to rest. They needed to keep moving, needed to find help, needed to find water. The stream had disappeared sometime during the morning, sinking into the earth and leaving them surrounded by dry grass and empty sky. That night, Martha gave the children the last of their food. She told them she wasn't hungry, but the truth. She was saving her portion for tomorrow when they might need it even more. She lay awake listening to Tommy's labored breathing and Lucy's restless movements. wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake by leaving the wagon. The third day brought the worst heat they'd experienced yet. The sun seemed to hang directly overhead, turning the grassland into a furnace. Martha's lips were cracked and bleeding. The children had stopped complaining, which scared her more than their earlier tears. They walked in silence now, holding hands, putting one foot in front of the other simply because their mother told them to. By afternoon, Tommy collapsed. One moment he was walking beside her, the next he was lying in the grass, his face pale and his breathing shallow. "Tommy!" Martha dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking as she felt his forehead. He was burning with fever again, but this time it wasn't sickness. It was the heat and exhaustion and dehydration. "Mama," he whispered, his eyes unfocused. "I can't can't get up." Martha looked around desperately. They were in the middle of nowhere, with no shelter, no water, no hope of rescue. Lucy was crying softly, her small body swaying with exhaustion. Martha realized with crystal clarity that they were all going to die out here, but then something inside her rebelled against that thought. She hadn't brought her children this far just to give up. She hadn't survived her husband's death, the loss of their farm, the cruelty of the wagon train, just to let them die in the middle of the plains. "Lucy," she said firmly, "I need you to be very brave right now. Can you do that for Mama?" Lucy nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "I'm going to make some shade for Tommy, and then I'm going to look for water. You need to stay right here with your brother and watch over him. Don't leave this spot, no matter what. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mama," Lucy whispered. Martha used her torn skirt and some dried grass to create a small lean-to shelter over Tommy. It wasn't much, but it would keep the sun off him. Then she kissed both children and started walking in widening circles around their makeshift camp. Searching for any sign of water, she found it an hour later, a small depression in the ground where rainwater had collected. It was muddy and warm, but it was water. Martha cupped her hands and drank deeply, then filled her container. The walk back to the children felt like it took forever, but when she arrived, both Tommy and Lucy were still alive, still breathing, still waiting for her. She gave them small sips of the precious water and watched some color return to their faces. Tommy even managed to sit up and smile at her. "Thank you, Mama," he said simply. That night, Martha made a decision that would either save them or doom them all. She couldn't carry both children much further, and Tommy was too weak to walk. But she also couldn't leave them here to die while she searched for help. She would have to choose. Take Lucy and go for help, leaving Tommy behind. Or stay with Tommy and hope that somehow, someway, rescue would find them. As she lay between her sleeping children under the vast star-filled sky, Martha closed her eyes and prayed harder than she'd ever prayed in her life. She prayed for strength, for wisdom, for a miracle. She prayed that somewhere out there in the darkness, help was coming. She had no way of knowing that her prayers were about to be answered in the most unexpected way possible. Martha woke to the sound of Lucy's weak crying. The morning sun was already high, which meant she'd slept longer than she'd intended. Her body ached from sleeping on the hard ground, and her throat felt like sandpaper. Beside her, Tommy lay still and pale, his breathing so shallow she had to lean close to make sure he was still alive. "Mama," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so thirsty." Martha's heart broke as she looked at her daughter. Lucy's lips were cracked and bleeding, her eyes sunken with dehydration. The little girl who used to run and laugh and sing had become a shadow of herself. Martha reached for their water container, knowing even before she lifted it that it was nearly empty. "Just a little sip, sweetheart," Martha said, helping Lucy drink. She saved a few drops for Tommy, who was too weak to lift his head. After giving the children what little water remained, Martha sat back on her heels and looked around at the endless grassland. The reality of their situation hit her like a physical blow. They were going to die out here, all three of them. Her children would never see their new life in California, would never grow up, would never have the chances she'd dreamed of giving them. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Martha forced herself to stand. She wouldn't give up. Not while there was still breath in her body. She'd made a promise to her husband's grave that she'd take care of their children, and she intended to keep that promise until her last heartbeat. "Lucy," she said gently, kneeling beside her daughter, "I need you to stay right here with Tommy. I'm going to walk over that hill and see if I can find help." Lucy's eyes widened with fear. "Don't leave us, Mama." "I'll be back, I promise. But if I don't find something soon, ... Martha's voice trailed off. She couldn't finish that sentence, couldn't voice the terrible truth they all knew. Martha kissed both children and started walking toward a low rise in the distance. Each step was agony. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, and her vision kept blurring. But she kept moving, driven by nothing more than a mother's desperate love. At the top of the hill, Martha shaded her eyes and looked in all directions. Nothing, just endless grass and empty sky. She was about to turn back when something caught her eye. Far in the distance, so far she thought she might be imagining it, was a small dark speck moving across the landscape. Martha stared until her eyes watered, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. It was moving too steadily to be an animal. Could it be a person? A wagon? Or was her mind playing tricks on her? She began to wave her arms and shout, even though she knew the figure was too far away to see or hear her. "Help, please help us!" Her voice came out as a hoarse croak, but she kept calling anyway. The speck seemed to change direction slightly, as if it had noticed something. Martha's heart began to race. She grabbed her torn skirt and waved it above her head like a flag, jumping and shouting with what little strength she had left. Slowly, impossibly, the figure began to grow larger. It was definitely moving toward her. Martha could now see it was a man on horseback, and he was riding hard in her direction. She stumbled down the hill, falling twice in her haste to get back to the children. "Lucy! Tommy!" she called out. "Someone's coming. Help is coming." The rider reached them just as Martha collapsed beside her children. He was a tall man with weathered skin and kind eyes, wearing the practical clothes of someone who spent his life outdoors. His horse was lathered with sweat from the hard ride. "Ma'am," he said, dismounting quickly, "I'm Jake Morrison. I saw you," signaling from the hill. He knelt beside Tommy, immediately taking in the dire situation. "How long have you been out here?" "4 days," Martha gasped. "We're out of water. The children ... they're so weak." Jake didn't waste time with questions. He pulled a canteen from his horse and carefully gave small sips to each child. Martha watched in amazement as color slowly returned to their faces. Tommy's eyes fluttered open, and Lucy managed a weak smile. "Easy now," Jake said gently to Tommy. "Small sips? Too much too fast will make you sick." Martha drank gratefully when Jake offered her the canteen. The water was the most wonderful thing she'd ever tasted. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved our lives." Jake studied her face, taking in the desperation and exhaustion he saw there. "What are you folks doing out here alone? Where's your wagon?" Martha told him the whole story about joining the wagon train, Tommy's illness, the fear of the other families, and their cruel abandonment. Jake's expression grew darker with each detail. "They left you out here to die," he said finally, his voice tight with anger. "A woman and 2 children. We tried to follow the tracks," Martha said, "but we got lost." Jake shook his head. "Those tracks you were following? They're heading straight into Badlands? Rocky country with no water for 50 miles. Even if you'd kept up with them, half that wagon train won't make it through." Martha felt a chill run down her spine. The very people who'd abandoned them were heading into danger themselves. "I know a place," Jake continued, "about 6 miles from here. There's a natural spring, good shelter, plenty of grass for the horse. We can rest there while you folks get your strength back." Jake helped Tommy onto his horse, then lifted Lucy up behind her brother. Martha walked alongside them, still weak but feeling more hope than she had in days. Jake led them to a hidden valley where crystal-clear water bubbled up from underground. There were trees for shade and soft grass to rest on over the next 2 days. Jake cared for them with a gentleness that surprised Martha. He caught fish from the stream, found edible plants, and gradually nursed them back to health. In the evenings, he told stories by the fire, tales of his life on the range, of places he'd seen and people he'd met. "I was driving cattle to market," he explained one night. "Had about 40 head, good price waiting for me in Denver. But when I saw you on that hill, ... he shrugged. "Cattle can wait. People can't." Martha learned that Jake had been alone for years, drifting from job to job across the frontier. He'd lost his own family to cholera when he was young, and he'd never had the heart to settle down again. "Funny thing," he said, watching Tommy and Lucy play by the stream. "I'd forgotten how good it feels to have someone to care for." On the third day, Jake made an announcement that would change everything. "There's a town called Cedar Falls about 2 days' ride south of here. Good people, growing fast. They could use someone like you, Martha, someone willing to work hard and start over." Martha looked at this man who'd saved their lives, who'd given up his own plans to help strangers. "What about your cattle? Your job in Denver?" Jake smiled, and for the first time since Martha had known him, he looked truly happy. "I'm thinking maybe it's time I found something more permanent. Something worth staying for." As the sun set over their little valley, Martha realized that losing everything might have been the best thing that ever happened to them. The morning they prepared to leave the valley felt like saying goodbye to a dream. Martha watched Tommy and Lucy play one last time by the stream where they'd spent the most peaceful days of their entire journey. Jake was packing supplies onto his horse, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who'd spent his life on the trail. "Are you sure about this?" Martha asked him for the third time that morning. "Giving up your cattle business, I mean, you barely know us." Jake looked up from securing the water containers to his saddle. "Martha, I've been alone for more years than I care to count. These past few days, watching your children laugh again, seeing you smile, it's reminded me what I've been missing." Martha felt her cheeks warm. Over the past week, she'd begun to notice things about Jake that had nothing to do with his rescuing them. The way he listened when Tommy told long, rambling stories about things he'd seen on the trail. How he braided Lucy's hair with surprising gentleness. The way his eyes crinkled when he laughed at Martha's attempts to cook fish over the campfire. "But what if we can't make it work in Cedar Falls?" Martha pressed. "What if there's no place for us there?" "Then we'll find somewhere else," Jake said simply. "The frontier's a big place, Martha. There's room for folks who aren't afraid to work hard and start over." The ride to Cedar Falls took 2 days, just as Jake had promised. Tommy rode behind Jake on the horse, chattering excitedly about everything he saw. Lucy rode with Martha on Jake's pack horse, a gentle Murray named Rosie, who seemed to understand she was carrying precious cargo. Martha had never seen country like this. Rolling hills covered with wildflowers, clear streams running through green meadows, and in the distance, mountains that looked like they touched the sky. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest tight with hope. "Is this really where we're going to live?" Lucy asked as they crested a hill and saw Cedar Falls spread out below them. The town was smaller than Martha had expected, maybe 30 buildings clustered around a main street, but it looked prosperous and well kept. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could see people moving about their daily business. After weeks of empty prairie, it looked like the most wonderful place on earth. "If they'll have us," Martha said quietly. Jake guided them down the main street, nodding to people who called out greetings. It was clear he was known here, and equally clear that people were curious about the woman and children traveling with him. They stopped in front of a neat building with a sign that read Miller's General Store. A stout woman with graying hair came out to meet them, wiping her hands on her apron. "Jake Morrison," she said with a warm smile. "Haven't seen you in months." "And who might these lovely people be?" "Mrs. Miller, I'd like you to meet Martha Henderson and her children, Tommy and Lucy." Jake dismounted and helped the children down. "They're looking for a fresh start." Mrs. Miller's sharp eyes took in Martha's worn dress and the children's thin faces. But instead of judgment, Martha saw only kindness in her expression. "Well, fresh starts are what Cedar Falls is all about," Mrs. Miller said. "Most of us came here with nothing but hope and determination. Come inside, all of you. I'll put coffee on and we can talk." Inside the store, Martha was amazed by the shelves lined with goods, everything from flour and sugar to bolts of fabric and farming tools. Mrs. Miller bustled about, setting out cups and a plate of cookies that made Tommy's eyes go wide. "Now then," Mrs. Miller said, settling into a chair across from them, "tell me your story." Martha found herself explaining everything: the failed farm, her husband's death, the wagon train, their abandonment on the prairie. Mrs. Miller listened without interruption, her expression growing more sympathetic with each detail. "Those people should be ashamed of themselves," Mrs. Miller said when Martha finished. "Leaving a mother and children to die like that. It's not Christian and it's not right." "Martha's a hard worker," Jake said quietly. "She kept her family together through things that would have broken most people." Mrs. Miller studied Martha for a long moment. "Can you read and write, dear?" "Yes, ma'am. My husband made sure of that." "Good figures, too?" Martha nodded. "I kept the books for our farm," Mrs. Miller smiled. "Well, it just so happens I've been looking for someone to help me run this store. My husband passed last spring, and I'm not as young as I used to be. The job comes with a small apartment upstairs. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and safe." Martha felt her heart leap. You'd give me a job?" "Just like that?" "Honey, in a town like this, we take care of each other. Jake vouching for you is good enough for me. Besides," she added with a wink, "I can tell a lot about a person by looking at their children. Any woman who raised children that polite and well-behaved is someone I want working with me." The apartment above the store was small but perfect. 2 bedrooms, a sitting area, and a little kitchen with a window that looked out over the main street. Tommy and Lucy ran from room to room, their excited voices echoing in the empty space. "Mama, look!" Lucy called from one of the bedrooms. "I can see the whole town from here." Martha stood in the doorway, watching her children explore their new home. For the first time in months, she could picture a future: Tommy going to school, Lucy making friends, herself building a life in this welcoming community. "What do you think?" Jake asked quietly, coming to stand beside her. "I think it's perfect," Martha said, then turned to face him. "But what about you? Where will you stay?" Jake's cheeks reddened slightly. "Well, I was thinking, that is, if you wouldn't mind, there's a boarding house down the street. I could get a room there while I look for work. Maybe we could see how things go between us." Martha felt her pulse quicken. "I'd like that," she said softly. That evening, the whole town seemed to turn out to welcome the new residents. Families brought food for an impromptu feast. Children gathered around Tommy and Lucy, and Martha found herself surrounded by friendly faces and warm conversation. "You're going to love it here," said Mrs. Patterson, no relation to the woman from the wagon train, but kind in the same way. "We've got a school starting up next month, and the church ladies meet every Tuesday for quilting." As the evening wound down, Martha stood on the store's front porch with Jake. The children were inside, exhausted but happy, already making plans for tomorrow's adventures. "Thank you," Martha said, looking up at the stars, "for everything. For saving us, for bringing us here, for giving us a chance at happiness." Jake took her hand gently. "Thank you for reminding me what happiness looks like." 6 months later, Martha stood in the same spot, but everything had changed. The store was thriving under her management. Tommy was top of his class in school. Lucy had made more friends than she knew what to do with. And Martha herself had found something she never expected to find again: love. Jake had proposed the week before, and Martha had said yes. Not because she needed rescuing, but because she'd discovered that sometimes the best things in life come when you're not looking for them. As she watched her children play in the street with their friends, Martha smiled. They'd lost everything on the prairie, but they'd found something better: a real home, a loving community, and a future bright with possibility.